area of the environment in Singapore. And I think since I've been in Europe, I started to turn my gaze towards the idea of plantations and to study and to research into the history of plantations in the context of the Netherlands. So I'm not sure, here amongst like the audience, who would be familiar, or what do you understand when you hear or think about plantations and history? But my work solely focuses on the historical ties between the Netherlands and in Indonesia, currently in Indonesia, a lot of, just broadly speaking, a lot of the land has been converted into palm oil plantations. So maybe you have seen images of land grabs of communities, having their land taken away from them, taken over by companies or governments, and subsequently the land has been converted to plantations. So these communities or villages have to live on plantations. But I think moving to or being able to access the archives in the Netherlands, it allowed me to really dive concretely into how the narratives of plantations, or specifically palm oil plantations, have over the course of 200 plus years, subsequently how the Dutch government or the VOC has justified these land grabs over the last few hundred years with policy papers, with legal documents. But I won't share all that research today. I just wanted to maybe share some ideas from the research I've been doing. And of course, because it's I wanted it to be a bit more informal, so feel free to type your thoughts or your questions in the chat. I think there is a chat. And then I will be able to answer as well. And in this session, apart from sharing some of the research and the questions and the thoughts, I would also like to introduce some sound as a form of exercise in listening to what's on the margins or what's seemingly far away. At least for myself in Europe, I am far away from the plantations. But I started to look into sound when I was here as a medium of trying to bridge these physical gaps, and alongside thinking of the relationships between humans and the natural environment, and all the modern human lives that live in the plantations currently as well. So let me just share some images that I've kind of put together. So, today I just I was just thinking of the panopticon and putting these ideas together as I was doing a lot more research into plantation logistics, plantation architecture, and how that's very similar to a lot of elements we find in society, such as surveillance systems. And I was just wondering what ideas could be generated when the word palm and panopticon comes together. And alongside thinking these ideas and the sound will come subsequently, I was also thinking of playing with or questioning the visual regimes that we've been fed of plantations. And I think that brought me to the idea of like kind of modern human or post-human lives. And slow me down if I'm talking too fast or I'm throwing too many ideas out. So this image you see here has been sort of kind of generated with machine learning, where I was wondering, what does it mean to have a dialogue with machines in the context of the plantations, where the machines we tend to talk about, especially 100 years ago, was technology in the form of railroad infrastructure, the Industrial Revolution and the idea of progress. But increasingly so today, there's a lot of advancements in agricultural sciences in the plantations or the palm oil plantations. From the big scale satellite imagery, how to plant effectively just by looking at maps, so pixel farming or pixelated farming, all the way to the nanoscale, where scientists look into how to modify the seeds best to allow for a hybrid seed that will allow for effective yields for each palm tree planted in each grid in the plantation. So just starting out as a very abstract and conceptual idea, I sort of just kind of scrapped a lot of images of the plantations. I kind of ran that through an algorithm. I am no machine learning expert, and my background is in urban farming. I've been working in fine dining, but I think in just trying to understand the processes and what it means to dialogue with the machine was very intriguing and eye-opening for myself to see what the algorithm could generate after kind of feeding and processing hundreds of images of oil palm plantations. So this is more of like an artistic response. And Nima also asked, what is pixelated farming? I don't have an image here, but some of the advancements, even the Netherlands, look at, if you were given a map, for instance, then how would you divide a map such that you can have the highest amount of palm trees planted in a given plot of land? So then the idea of pixel farming comes in, where you're able to, through the use of maps, and here mapping technology comes in, one is able to derive the best sort of formula for how many palm trees you can plant per plot. A tongue twister there. And of course, with seed breeding, one can decide, or the scientists can decide, the companies can decide what seeds to grow in that particular plot that the programs have kind of suggested. So in a given plantation, say in the context of West Indonesia, the companies or the plantation owners will know where to plant the trees or the seedlings, what kind of seeds to plant, what kind of conditions are best, and when to plant, when to harvest. So a lot of things are kind of suggested by machines, and it is a form of dialogue with a machine there. However, I will argue that it's one that tends to be of exploitation, where we use machines as an extension of our hands to harm the land and extract from the land. And that's why it brought me to algorithms, where I wondered, what could it mean to find other ways of dialoguing with humans as a simple starting point. So the idea of panopticon means that there could be many eyes, and I'm just talking very loosely here, not really diving deep into the foundations of where the panopticon is derived from. Many eyes here refer to, and I'll just show you more images as I talk. Many eyes refer to not just the palm trees that seem very sterile in a kind of grid-like model, but also the many lives that live in the plantations. So as I mentioned, the communities where the land has been dispossessed from them, and of course, the communities would range depending on which areas the plantations are grown in. So you can loosely call them indigenous communities, but I think local communities for me would work best. There's also a lot of invasive species. I would argue that the palm tree itself, which is derived from West Africa, is an invasive species that does not originate from Southeast Asia. And with that, a whole host of ecologies, ecosystems that have been brought in, is intermingled with that of the natural rainforest, because there are still natural rainforests found in some parts of West Indonesia, specifically Sumatra Island. There's stories of ghosts or spirits that these communities, or I guess many cultures in Indonesia and in the part of the Malay archipelago also believe in. And these stories are told through oral formats, obviously. And I was thinking, how do we surface these stories and these lives and these voices as a way to address the archives that I have tried to access in these institutions in the Netherlands. And also to consider what notions of a living archive could be in the context of a plantations as well. So this is another image that's derived from algorithms that I've played with just a few weeks back, just to understand how the visual regimes could be transformed when I simply have a dialogue with a machine loosely speaking. And I'm so sorry for the blurry images, but maybe if you kind of sit far away, you get this, have a better sense of what these are. So I just wanted to start off with the idea of infrastructure, at least in the context of Sumatra Island in Indonesia, where the first railroads and the railway tracks were built. It introduced where the plantations were built, obviously by the VOC or the Dutch colonizers, to introduce, not so much to improve the livelihoods of the communities there, but arguably to transport the commodities that were grown in the plantations out. And their shipping lines and supply chains were developed, so it could be shipped to, back then, Western Europe. But I would say most notably through Rotterdam as well, and some companies that you may recognize today that have benefited a lot from specifically the plantations in this part of the world would be Unilever. Still today, you may have heard that they still use a lot of palm oil in their products, although it's not just the products found in Sumatra Island, but from different parts of the world, including the region of Africa, South America as well. So the history of slavery and, of course, technology that comes in when at least the VOC wanted to scale up production in the plantations meant that one or groups or communities had to think of ways to mechanize, introduce technology or instruments to make efficient and improve the productivity of the plantation model itself. So this is an image I found, I think, specifically in, I'm not sure which part of West Africa, but I think the image kind of shows me or tells me a lot about how the mechanisms we see today are far more advanced than what we've seen in the past, where, laborers had to thread on or stamp on the palm kernels with their bare feet and kind of pound them with like instruments fashioned from wood as well. And they would store them in huts. You can see in the middle of the picture, supervised by someone perhaps from the colonial powers itself. And here is a diorama, an exhibit that was showcased by the Dutch in one of the world fairs in Paris, I think. And what I understand from this particular research where the Dutch chose to show these specific images was that he wanted to tell the world the story of progress that it had developed in other parts of the world, notably in Indonesia, where instead of coffee, rubber, tea, it found that oil palm trees had derived the highest amount of money per hectare or per tree. And they have obviously derived a kind of formula back then with railroad infrastructures and laborers in the plantation systems to kind of like develop the palm oil products that were sold under Unilever in the UK and also in the Netherlands. And I say Unilever because Unilever is headquartered in Rotterdam and also in London, I think. And up to today, there is a close relationship between the state and these multinational corporations that have its origins or foundations in extraction regimes hundreds of years ago. So this is just an example of the factories in the UK where palm oil was transported in barrels to, I think this is Unilever's earlier productions for soap. One of the first products that palm oil was used was in soap manufacturing, and the barrels were transported for production in one of their factories here. I do not know what specifically this factory's purpose is for, but my best guess is this is probably situated near a port so that you can easily offload things and then go straight to manufacturing. And arguably use these products such as margarine and soap that was part and also helped to fuel the Industrial Revolution. And subsequently, more production and more demand of commodities such as palm oil in other parts of the world that also justified the expansion of plantations in Indonesia, for example. So that brings me to today, where right now I'm currently looking into one of the communities in Sumatra. This is, however, of a rubber tree. I will just put a disclaimer in case you think you wonder why it looks different. But the Talang Mamak community works with rubber and also oil palm trees. And I think it really shows the dispossession from when there was a time where they had access to their sacred lands. And today, a lot of them derive their livelihoods from harvesting rubber, latex, or trees. And I would say that a lot of their livelihoods have not really improved a lot the last hundreds of years as compared to the progress in other parts of the world. They have really benefited from the sales of palm oil and derived products as well. So this is one of the factories owned by, I think, Wilmar, one of the big palm oil plantation companies that's headquartered in Singapore, but also they have factories in Rotterdam. As I'm currently looking into how these colonial ties stretch till today. So that's the end of like a very short introduction to palm oil histories. Not looking at palm oil sciences and progress, but just how the colonial regime, at least for the VOC, still continues today and is quite present in the plantations and in company multinational structures that are still headquartered there, but spread across Southeast Asia, notably in Singapore, Indonesia, and maybe Malaysia as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask, but I would like to try to move on to show you some of the videos and images they have compiled together, more as a thought exercise into the scales of lives and voices that one can find in the plantations. So the first video I'll show you is derived from, I'll just post the link first in case so you can't hear it. But just watch it in a bit. Let me explain this. The first video that I've compiled together with another collaborator is derived from the images, microscopic images from a plant scientist, one of our collaborators here. And it's really interesting research because if I'm interested to see how we can move on from the plantations, then one of the key arguments I would like to maybe push for or try to prove is that plants do have an intelligence of sorts, and the intelligence can be revealed in many ways, including communication. And I guess it's an up-and-coming topic alongside words such as mycelium being thrown out. But what Alexis, the scientist, showed me were really interesting images that we kind of put together in the collage, and sounds that were derived, or vibrations that were derived from the plant cells. And what the plant or the cell is exactly vibrating or saying, I will not hesitate. I will not say we know that much, but I think in terms of science, the scientists are in really early stages in trying to determine and establishing what intelligence looks like for plants. Yes, this is a collaborative art project that we made with scientists. But maybe because I keep saying thought experiments, I would just say that how I think and how I learned to think a bit differently, apart from writing, is also by composing and assembling and deconstructing sounds and images and putting them in video as a way to process these thoughts from this different disciplines as well. So feel free to play it from your computer because the sound is best when heard from your computer, but I can also share screen and we'll play that together. So that was the first video, and maybe just to explain the first video, the sounds were when we received the vibrations that was translated into sound data subsequently by the lab itself. I had to play around with the sounds because it actually came to us as noise. So it was just like zzz for maybe a good 4 seconds or something. And it was only after trying to stretch the sounds, from 5 minutes, from like a few seconds of noise or seemingly white noise to maybe half an hour of sound, where I would slow it down and I tried not to alter the pitches, and what's not, it started to you started to hear the textures that you can hear in the video. So, and all I did was just to enhance a bit of the effects by maybe adding in echoes to kind of give people a sense of just to kind of soften the sounds, because it can be very harsh if just heard on its own. But I think what this exercise for myself was a very good reminder that plant time is actually quite different from how humans perceive time. in that what takes me 4 seconds to hear or to see would take maybe a few days to unravel, for instance. And I would say that it doesn't really correspond with the video, in case you were thinking it's like a frame by frame sequence. And that's where maybe the designers or the artistry could come in to help people to reimagine perceptions. And Paris asked if this is a video designed for web. So interestingly, from this video exercise that my collaborator John and myself worked with, so we just, instead of talking, we just edit videos and share that with each other. What we did was we tried to play around with motion sensing. In the hypothetical question of what does it mean to sing with a plant? If this for us was the sound of plants singing, could we sing not to plants but with plants? So with the sounds, we kind of designed that for a web platform. So the videos were edited tweaked so that it could appear on the web. And I'm happy to maybe share that link later on when the web is up, but maybe not now, because I think there's still some code we need to tweak. But the idea is if you could turn on your web camera and like just move like a Kinect, move your hands or your body, or move like a plant, grow like a plant, then perhaps that could correspond with sound. And that's our way of trying to map motion with sound, even if it's not scientifically accurate at all. But it could give a better sense of how we or humans could try to or attempt to relate to plants, just as a starting point. And I think for myself, scientific rigor is somewhat important, rather than take too many artistic liberties as we have done already. So we did try to send this back to Alexis and his colleagues in other labs in France who work on similar topics of plant intelligence and the vibrations as well, or bioacoustic feedback measures. I'll just type it in. So if you're interested, you can Google a bit more as well. And it was really nice to hear that the other people we have sent the videos and the sounds to understood where we were coming from. And that for me is like a really nice affirmation, at least from the scientific community, that where we're trying to go in terms of bringing in human-plant interaction or designing interfaces was maybe a good first step. Of course, no doubt I would emphasize that it's probably impossible to remove the human from the picture when we are designing things, but I'm trying to be mindful of my own actions when I make these kind of decisions as well. But let's move on to some videos, or at least one more video, and then we can have a chat. If there's a Q&A, I don't know, time for a Q&A as well. And this is a short video that kind of takes more from the news and social media kind of collaterals that I see on palm oil plantations in the context of Indonesia. Well, the previous one was an exercise in visual skills. So let me just play this. This is 2 minutes long.
lebih.
Dan barang bukti dan lain-lain untuk penegakan hukum ke Polda nanti bekerja sama dengan Dinas Kehutanan dan KLHK.
kita 10.000 hektar. Untuk Jambi, lahan yang terbakar total mencapai 11.000 lahan yang terbakar total mencapai lahan yang terbakar total mencapai 11.000 hektar. 5.819 ini. Di 19 ini. Yang kita konsumsi adalah rawa. Sesuatu yang sangat sulit harus kita akui. Karenanya pencegahan sesuai dengan perintah Presiden akan jauh lebih baik dibandingkan penanggulangan.
Titik-titik api baru ini kemudian kami berusaha untuk melihat situasi. Titik-titik api baru ini kemudian kami berusaha untuk titik-titik api baru kemudian kami berusaha untuk melihat situasi di dalam. Akhirnya kami menemukan orang-orang yang dicurigai membakar, juga sedang melaksanakan aktivitas pembalakan liar. Ada 3 orang, sekitar 15 orang kemudian melarikan diri. Namun demikian dari 3 orang.
Sejumlah kepala desa yang saya temui, saya tanya kepada mereka, kenapa setiap tahun terjadi seperti ini? Kepala desa mengatakan secara jujur kepada saya bahwa sekitar 10 sampai 15 orang setiap desa itu dibayar oleh tanda kutip beberapa pihak untuk membakar. Nah, kalau melihat
so what I would say is that the videos and the music you hear, I took a lot of liberties with that, and I replayed certain things that a lot of them were mostly like corporate social responsibility sort of blah blahs, like this is what we'll do to make things better for Indonesia or for the province of Jambi, by the companies themselves or by the mayor of that particular area. And I think as a Singaporean living in Singapore, our experience of the forest fires that often come from burning palm oil, palm trees. It's very hazy. So every year, at least twice a year, we would have to kind of like wade through or be engulfed in this haze that engulfs the whole city. It doesn't just spread the surface in Indonesia, but it spreads to perhaps Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam as well. And that was just my point of view of how I interpret the corporate social responsibility speak, and what I make of all these kind of feel-good speeches. But I think it's still a good exercise to understand what languages do these stakeholders speak in, like not in terms of like Bahasa Indonesia, but in terms of the words they choose and how they choose to phrase certain words, in order to kind of soothe over the issues. And what my response as I edit the video is towards that, and how I would kind of contrast that with the previous video as well. So I think that's all in a very simple listening exercises. I think currently I have been working with my collaborator John and scientist Alexis and some other scientists who work in the area of plant intelligence to look more in depth into the soil as an ecosystem. So as I mentioned, mycelium, another scientist also looks at how plants communicate in the soil through their roots as a form of intelligence, but at the same time how mycelial kind of networks allow for these signals to be communicated, and how might we choose to interpret these scientific notions more abstractly. How do we weave in the voices of the machines, the invasive species, the lost stories by the communities, or at least for the Talang Mamak? How could we weave them in? And do we respond for them, or do we just put together these form of evidences and share them with the public as I am sharing with you now? These are questions I am trying to maybe figure out and think through first. But if you have any questions or any thoughts or like what the reality in the plantations are, or if you have any suggestions, welcome them. And I'm not sure how this Q&A would work, if like people can ask questions or you're supposed to type in the chat and I answer them, but feel free to ask. I'm happy to answer, or I'm happy to try to share more work if you have any ideas on what you want to hear or see whatsoever. Yeah. But at the same time, I think it'll be nice for me to hear your thoughts, having looked at these videos, like you feel like you understand certain voices, or at least my voice, or is it too abstract? And I would say like I am trying to translate a lot of ideas, firstly from a research point of view. I'm trying to keep that rigor, but trying to play creatively with certain ideas as well. Then I had to learn how to edit sound along the way, record sound as well. Actually, my background was in policy, as Nima asked. But I think after I did something a bit too rigid, it was mostly research based. Just to share briefly, most of my peers went on to become consultants or to work in governments. And because my focus was in food security, I ended up becoming an urban farmer in Singapore. One which my parents were very shocked, surprised, and really upset, because this stigma of a farmer in Singapore was quite real. And obviously, most parents would prefer their kids, at least in my country, to have white-collar jobs. So how did I end up on this art science path? I think as I continue to work with plants, and a lot of my work, my previous works earlier in the non-art realm, was to, you can call it landscaping architecture, or where we had to design gardens, edible gardens for the landscape of Singapore. You know, tall skyscrapers, what would indoor farms look like, what would underground mushroom caves look like. It was part speculative, part real, and we had to learn to speak the language of government and speak the language of the public, so as to really have everyone buy in as we continue to talk about urban farming. At the same time, and that's when I started to really weave in the arts and the sciences, because I do think we need some form of persuasion from different sides in order for others to understand where we are coming from. At the same time, I also found that I was very intrigued by these intersections that we live in. So one simple question is, how come scientists are not typically able to speak to the arts? And that's where I found intersections. There's a lot of room for play in these intersections. And that's why a lot of my work actually looks at ecology, science, and a bit of the arts, but primarily in the area of looking at Southeast Asia, because I would like to. There's so much issues that I think we could do a lot more storytelling about. And beyond us, if I got any feedback from these neo-colonial entities on my work, are they all quiet or CSR bullshitty? So I thought that I had dealt enough with Singaporean bureaucrats before moving to the EU, but I feel like it's been a lot more challenging moving here, because I think last week or 2 weeks ago, it was World Food Day, and I was invited to share on my very abstract work on plantations with a select group of government officials from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the Dutch government. And of course, the big agribusiness owners were there as well. So it's really an important platform. And I had to decide what balance I could bring in. So should I bring in a bit of that Singaporean, like I'm diplomat, I speak a neutral language. But at the same time, should I bring in that artistic activist side of me? So I decided to just plainly share about these more conceptual questions of what it means to speak to or live in the time of a post-human plantationocene. Of course, I tried to erase all these words, but just say, how could I engage and understand machines on a more personal level? And I shared these images derived from algorithms with them. It was really interesting, but also very heartbreaking because to one of my colleagues, the agribusiness owner and the diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was like, yawn, such a dramatic presentation. And I was heartbroken because, I came all the way to the Netherlands and, it's really nice to be able to speak to you, but it has affirmed everything I knew about this phase, this CSR, this, these kind of so-called big, bad agribusiness kind of points of views. But beyond affirming that point of view, it also gave me a face to these voices that I've been hearing from the margin, so to speak. And of course, I will not change my stand, but maybe I would think a bit more about how to present more compelling stories rather than like, oh, you're a bad guy, you should like stop your businesses and not profit. Because I think there is a room for a bit more free play and freewheeling in terms of the languages I would like and the stories I would like to tell. And it was a good feedback from these spokespersons on how I could tell the stories differently otherwise next time I meet them. So that's a kind of long-winded answer to your question, Beyond. They were not CSR bullshitty at all, but they were just being plain like C-suite businessmen, like dismiss you kind of thing. And Lola asked if it's difficult to convince scientists to engage in art. I would say yes, to some extent. One is to be able to learn to speak the language of science. And sometimes maybe this is just more of my own personal insecurity, but I have this need to want to show that I can engage in the same scientific rigor as a scientist. So I try to read their papers before I reach out to them, so I can think of relevant questions that really speak to what particular scientists are looking at, rather than just innocently saying, can we collaborate with you on an art project? And I'm saying this because some scientists who may have collaborated may have this idea or a very flat stereotype of designers and artists. And I try to show that, at least in my interactions with them, be it through emails or in person or on phone calls, that I understand, or I try to understand what they're working with, funding difficulties or translating languages. And I think, of course, a lot of times I still get rejections from scientists I hope to work with. And they are sometimes very busy people, because they, if they are academics, they have a lot of papers to write and review. And I think that's why I have to kind of position my ideas and, for the lack of a better phrase, find compelling angles for them to want to engage in dialogue with me before so-called dragging them into this plant music world that we have been designing, so that they understand the motivations. And in the area of the plantation, I would say I dare not touch this area of working with scientists who have been funded by agribusinesses or look at, say, oil palm related innovations. because I'm not sure what position I should take, and what languages I should speak, and what the scientists think. Because so far the collaborations I've had with scientists are mostly relating to scientists who work in educational institutions. So that's been much easier because they have less pressure to report their findings back to their funders, so to speak. But perhaps when I find other angles that could engage the scientists who work really in plantation-related innovations, I'm able to start a dialogue with them and understand where they're coming from, and perhaps see an art science angle in this sort of more loaded area where it can, in the plantation debate, it can tend to be a dichotomy of all the activists from Greenpeace trying to burn our companies or stop us. And on the other hand, it can also seem like the bad business owners in their boardrooms in Singapore and Rotterdam, kind of just looking at stock market prices or palm oil futures. But I think what I'm trying to do with my ongoing research is to surface the in-between or the complexity of voices there are in the landscape that are oftentimes forgotten up to today. Yes, are there any other questions or thoughts? I think we may have to wrap up soon, but it'll be nice to hear some thoughts from any of you as well, or ideas. Yeah, actually, Nima, I have, like I mentioned earlier, I have no background in sound whatsoever. I have been mostly working on planting, literally plants, mushrooms, algae. I guess you can call it biodesign to some extent. And it's only when I move, I think it allowed me to shift and open up the space for me to think creatively about my own practice and move into the arts. And that's where I moved into sound design, and to see how I could even mix and master my own field recordings, some from the plantations itself, into something more relatable to not just human ears, but to plant ears if they could listen. When I mean making things relatable to plant ears, the listening spectrum for plants and non-human beings it could be lower or higher in terms of the frequency that they perceive. And I think that's conceptually that's been really interesting for me. And that's why when I design sounds, I try to play that in different frequencies as a multi-layered, multi-frequency composition, to see what it could be to have a composition for human and non-human counterparts as part of this ongoing continuous idea of what it means to dialogue with a non-human. And I won't go into theoretical debates on what the human and non-human means and if we should question these terminologies. I think in the academic realm, there's a lot of debate on whether we should redefine these terms. But I think I have accepted very happily sound as part of my practice because it also teaches me to listen, not just when I'm composing, but obviously as plants teach me how to listen and be quiet and know when to not respond and not speak, but merely just to absorb it as well. And I think composing sounds is merely my way of responding to what I've learned. Actually, just in the past year that I've been based in Europe as well. So thank you for your questions. And I wonder, the DICE organizers, if we should wrap up here. What do you say?